So they have a clever plan, at least how to get to the 300 billion in Russian frozen assets, and this one, this is an incredible scheme. This is a scheme that they are putting together. Reparation bonds. Reuters reported on this. Let's talk about reparation bonds.
This is the craziest scheme of all. It is a lunatic scheme. It really does make me wonder what lawyers they are talking to, because they apparently think that this is going to provide them with some kind of legally foolproof way to basically seize or use Russian assets to keep the war going. In fact, it actually, legally speaking, puts them on even weaker ground than simply passing a law and seizing the assets would do. Let's just explain what the idea is. So the idea is that Ukraine funds its war by issuing bonds. And as collateral for these bonds, it uses the Russian frozen assets. This is presumably in anticipation of, Ukraine becoming victorious in the end and, being able to get reparations from the Russians. And it apparently is acknowledged that private investors are going to be very wary of buying these bonds. So the idea is that central banks will do it. It'll be mainly central banks that will be buying these bonds. Now, I am just going to read the English definition, the English common law definition of theft as set out in Section 1 of the Theft Act. So it says, a person is guilty of theft if he dishonestly appropriates property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it, and thief and steal shall be construed accordingly. And we've had, the key word there is appropriation. And English legal definitions, including in the Theft Act, make it clear that appropriation is using another's property as your own. Well, isn't this exactly what this is proposing? Ukraine is going to issue bonds, and it's going to cite as collateral the property of another country, which is to say Russia, which has not agreed to allow its property to be used as collateral in that way. I mean, that is clearly an appropriation of someone else's property in order to borrow against it. In fact, I can tell you there is a huge amount of precedent on this kind of thing. Whenever it happens, it happens. So, I mean, borrowing against someone else's property, using someone else's property without their permission as security, that is clearly a dishonest appropriation. It has to be dishonest because the other side have not agreed to it. And of course, you're doing it with the intention of permanently depriving the other party of it. So it is theft. It's straightforward theft. And it is asking Western central banks to launder the money on behalf of Ukraine by buying these bonds. I mean, it makes them accessories to this act of theft. It also means, by the way, because if Ukraine doesn't win its war and doesn't get the Russians to agree to it, not only would the central banks be committing an act of theft themselves and become accessories to this act of theft under English law, but of course they would in effect be printing money in the meantime in support of Ukraine. So I mean, this is so crazy. It is ridiculous. If you actually pass a law saying, we don't accept that these assets really belong to Russia anymore because we think that, through this aggression against Ukraine, this, is property that the Russians aren't entitled to any longer. Well, that might not be defendable, but it is more defendable than this, because if you use someone else's property as collateral, you are acknowledging that that property belongs to that other person. It acknowledges that these assets are Russian assets. So it actually makes the whole situation, legally speaking, even worse. So, as I said, this is so crazy, so stupid, that I really do ask myself, what legal advice are they getting?